Greetings from the Dark Continent, Conscious Caracal here, or Adams van Sail, and tonight we're going to be not shining a light specifically on current affairs in South Africa, but we're rather going to be having a conversation about some more lasting ideas, something a bit more eternal, maybe even something that you have been thinking about, or themes that touch on some of your worries or thoughts recently living in South Africa or even abroad, because I think these ideas are a lot more applicable, not just for South Africa, but maybe even the Western world at large. Joining me for this conversation is my friend Russell Lamberti. He's the chief economist at Sakeliga. You might recognize him from previous episodes on the show, and we're going to be having an excellent conversation here that I'm looking forward to. Welcome to the program, Russell.
Thank you, Ernst. Very, very good to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation, and yeah, it's just such an honor to be with you and talking about these things, and hopefully we can share some really, really useful insights for people.
Well, we're living in interesting times, and interesting times bring some interesting ideas to the fore, and I think they stimulate interesting conversations as well. So the main theme that I wanted to talk about here today is something you've said in the past. Now, I can't remember exactly what the issue was you were responding to, but you shared the sentiment that there's a time to move and a time to dig a trench. Now, I don't think we even need the context within which you said it. I think it's pretty clear what you meant there, but maybe just for the audience's sake, can you elaborate a bit more on this sentiment of digging a trench and maybe moving?
Yeah. So a lot of what I tweet is me dealing with my own demons and ministering to myself, as it were. So, I don't have everything figured out on these things by no means, and I think though that a lot of us are dealing with this issue that we've grown up out of a very strong secular liberal frame, and one of the things that frame says that we not only can do but maybe should do is move as much as possible. The world is your oyster. You're free to go anywhere you want. Now, there's parts about that are very appealing, and there's certainly a time for that kind of exploration. It's a beautiful big world out there. But if you can live anywhere, sometimes you forget to live somewhere. And we're a people who very often haven't invested in a place, haven't invested in a people, haven't sunk time, energy, and resources into making a place beautiful and into really caring for places. So we have a world of people on the run, and as soon as a town or a city or a province or a country becomes degraded, gets worse, becomes more uncomfortable, what do? Instead of trying to fix it, we move. We move to somewhere else, and I've done this in my life. Many people have done this. And then you move to the next cool place. You move to the next best place. But that place then gets filled up with people who have the same sort of mindset, rather than necessarily investing in these places and keeping chaos at bay. They just enjoy the fruits of what was done in years past that made these places wonderful and beautiful, but they don't actually spend the time and the energy and the resources and develop the systems that maintain order in these places. And so the minute that place degrades, what do? You just move on to the next place. And that's a game that I think is running out in the Western world. There's fewer and fewer sanctuaries and havens left for people to run to. The water level's rising, and as you try and run to these places of higher ground, you might buy yourself some time, but you're really just kind of delaying the inevitable, which is that at some point you have to dig a trench. Okay, you have to fight for the place. You have to put in place things that are going to push back against the chaos and actually make a difference. Either you're going to do it, or your grandchild is going to have to do it. And if you don't do it, you're going to shift that burden onto future generations. So the best time is really now in many ways. So I think it's just, saying that there's a time to move and a time to dig a trench is to say moving is not inherently a bad thing. Leaving a place is not inherently a bad thing. There's many good examples. There's many good biblical examples, for example, of people leaving bad situations. But then there's also examples of people establishing themselves in a particular context and digging a trench. So it's to recognize that if you're going to move, what is the reason for that for why you're moving. Maybe you're leaving a situation that's unsalvageable. And I don't think we're suggesting that humans have to suffer through the most awful existence as though that's inherently a virtue. Okay, some situations you need to leave. But then the mindset has to be that where I'm going there recognizing that there's no utopia, and that I get to higher ground, not so that I can relax and kick my feet up and enjoy the fruits of that civilization, but so that I can actually establish a place from which to fight and defend that place. And that's, we'll get into this. I don't want to jump the gun too much, but I think that's one of the ways that we must encourage people to think about emigration. If you're going to emigrate, don't see it as an opportunity to just go and have a lifelong holiday, because what you're going to do is you're going to eventually, the chaos will arrive to that place, and you're going to have to dig a trench and fight for it at some point. So it's to move and it's to emigrate with the mindset of, I'm going to go somewhere in order to establish lasting community, love that place, love that people, and build the mechanisms of order that can actually maintain that civilization for at least in my generation and hopefully beyond. So these are the sorts of themes that I'm grappling with. It's about how do we kind of perceive the problem, and what are we running away from, and what are we running to, and why are we running to it? And sometimes those reasons are not healthy. And I think you see it in some immigration disaster stories, where people actually were running away from themselves a little bit. And when they arrived in the new place, guess what? They were still there, and they didn't really escape their problems.
So Russell, we were talking before we started recording, and you mentioned, you started talking about this new phenomenon where you see people working from home. There's all these new possibilities that are given to us by technology. You can now do an online business, you can do all your work online, and you can just go to live in some nice place of your choice and do your work from there. It's no longer the typical story of you have to go live in a terrible city, but you get the job that you want. So you get all these people, they're not moving to Chicago or to Santon, they're moving to a beautiful coastline, coastal city or a Mediterranean scene. You can live in the environment that you want and still do the job that you want. But you made an interesting observation there on why these places are so nice. If you could just repeat that here while we're in studio.
Yeah, so there's this modern phenomenon, this modern kind of trend, I guess, or this idea, because very often it's actually more an idea than something that people are actually able to execute on. Very few, and a very sort of thin elite can actually live this sort of lifestyle. But anyway, as you say, people are able to, depending on the job you have, to go and move around and live in these beautiful places. And what do they find in these places? They find established communities, beautiful shops, cobbled streets, well taken care of environment, and just generally very, very pleasant places to live. And those places are like that because of the people who stick around, because of the people who live there, who've lived there for generations, invested their lives in those places, their money, their capital. They've lived in, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 generations, maybe more, have lived in the same house. And those people have a huge stake in that town. They've got skin in the game. So they've curated it, they've looked after it, and that's why it's so beautiful. If it was just a town that was full of people who were nomads, who were like passing ships in the night, so just an infrastructure with a bunch of empty bedrooms that would fill up periodically and people would come and go, it would be almost impossible to conceive of that town being attractive, being beautiful, being looked after, being the place that would invite you to go and live there. And so this idea of the nomadic lifestyle, the kind of, in some ways, the modern ideal, is unsustainable and is built on the back of people who decided to build real communities. Now, okay, you can have a life where some people are nomadic, and in some ways I think that's unavoidable. I think you're always going to get people in a society that are a bit restless, and that's probably healthy actually to have a portion of those kind of people. I think when we try and turn this kind of idea of lifestyle into a norm, into like an upper middle class ideal, we start to lose the ability to actually build beautiful places and maintain beautiful places. And I think a lot of the degradation of modernity that we're seeing in the West, we see it in South Africa, is there's far too many people living this. It might not be the hyper nomadic laptop lifestyle, but it's the idea that you go to a place that's nice and comfortable, and when it gets a bit uncomfortable, you can just move. You know, well, where you're moving to? Or you have to move somewhere where people at some point decided, look, we're going to keep this place nice. And if no one's doing that, then that place is on borrowed time. It's on the road to chaos. You know, and that's why I say, if you don't have a bunch of people willing to dig a trench at some point, you're just buying time for, and you're going to force your grandchild to fight against that chaos at some point, because that water level is going to rise, and eventually you get to the highest point of land, and there's nowhere else to go, you know. And I think if you think about history, you know, you think about how people fought wars, how they clashed up against each other, and you think, oh, how could they do that? I would never do that. You know, that's such ancient sort of, you know, pre-modern savage behavior. But when you get people who get forced into a corner and they start losing options, and their lifestyle comes under immense threat, and they actually can't move around, that's when they do start to stand up for themselves. Now, it might be ugly, it might end in bloodshed. We certainly hope not. We hope that people can find peaceful ways to resist and to stand up and to protect themselves. But either way, the point is made that that it's when you have to. And I suppose what I'm suggesting is we all actually have to. We have to. People have to make a call, dig those trenches. If you're going to move somewhere, that's fine, but know that's a place where you're going to have to establish a kind of beachhead of resistance. And I suppose if we bring that to a South African context, a lot of us are deciding that, for better or worse, we're digging a trench here.
And that's the thing, is I've always maintained that the only true freedom is possible on the frontier. Now, it doesn't have to be a literal frontier. It can be a frontier of just opportunity and change, and in a changing and interesting and troubling time. But at the same time, when you look at South Africa and you find yourself here, you're not someone that is contemplating leaving. You're in that trench mindset, from what I can hear and from our conversations. But at the same time, when you look at, for example, what a lot of people's attitudes are towards change and suffering and, well, just hardship around them, is that they think, well, this was something that I thought was left in the past. I thought in the past blood was spilt and sweat and
times were
trouble.
difficult.
Yeah.
People suffered and struggled.
But they went through that so that I can have a nice life today. Why am I going through a bunch of struggle? That's not fair.
Yes.
But they need to realize that that's the human condition. There's always going to be struggle. There's always going to be strife. There's always going to be challenges. And for you to think that your ancestors paid the bill and you can just now have an open tab at the bar and you're never going to have to pay again, I think it's a very naive way of looking at it. But
very well put.
There's also a liberating, or more of a positive sense, a positive element in that as well, and that is, if you're living in troubling times, it gives you the opportunity to be righteous. It gives you the opportunity to be a great man or a great figure. It's like that old adage of weak men create bad times create strong men create good times. Well, the positive thing about living in bad times is you have the opportunity to be a strong man. And that is, I think, one of the most meaning-giving and fulfilling elements that you can give to anyone.
It's hard to follow that up, because you've put it so well and summarized it so well. So maybe, I mean, the one thing I would add to that is to say that, also, firstly, on a personal level, I mean, I don't think any of us should ever say never to what life might throw at us and cause us to have to do. So the future's complex. Life's complex. I would just say to people that, like, leaving South Africa, it's a big debate. You know, historically, particularly for English South Africans, it's been very attractive, because you've got this menu of Anglo culture options that are very attractive places, right? You've got the whole of America to choose from. You've got Canada, you've got Britain, you've got Australia and New Zealand, beautiful climates, beaches.
People speak your language, share your culture and heritage.
And they speak your language, and if you're an English South African, the cultural differences between you and an Australian and New Zealander or something they're there, but they're not very big. You can integrate quite quickly. But of course, now we find ourselves in a situation where there's a crisis in Anglo culture. I mean, some of the most tyrannical countries right now in the world are English countries. It's almost like it's the English nation, it's the English people's turn to have tyranny, because they sort of avoided it in the world wars.
Yeah, the honeymoon period's over, it seems.
Yeah, and it's almost like every people group has suffered under some form of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and the English world sort of sailed through the 20th century basically with no totalitarian, authoritarian kind of system.
They were spreading their values all across the world.
They
thought values. Like we had figured it out. So
yeah, exactly. Anyway, that's now the culture of Anglo-dom, and it's an interesting one because as you sit in South Africa, and of course Afrikaners, whether they like to admit it or not, are quite an English-influenced people, and so it's not difficult for an Afrikaner to move to Australia either, or to emigrate. I mean, it's a little bit more difficult culturally, but nonetheless, all of us sit here. We look at these countries and we go, whoa, this is not necessarily such an appealing idea. So I think that's an interesting angle to this whole thing. But secondly, I think it's to say that if you're going to move somewhere, as I said earlier, your mindset and your reasons must be pure, as it were, must be right. And I think a right reason to move, would be if someone came to me and said, look, I'm going to move to this place, I'm going to move to Tennessee, or I'm going to move to Florida or something. And when I get there, I'm establishing a community, I'm investing, I'm planning for my grandchildren to grow up there. I want to own property, and I want to cultivate that property, and I want to defend what I perceive is a culture worth defending. And because chaos is going to come there at some point, it's going to come knocking, and when it does, I want to have established the community structures and the mechanisms for being able to fight that. And then when it gets difficult, I'm going to stick around. If someone says to me, like, that's why they're going somewhere, then I think that's a great and good reason to be moving. And sometimes it's because you're leaving a situation that you perceive to just be unwinnable or just unbearable. And there are times to leave places. There was once a king who decided he was going to kill every little baby boy in the country, and Jesus' family left. They emigrated to Egypt temporarily because there was an unbearable situation. And when that threat had passed, then they happened to come back. So there's a long history of people moving. I mean, our country is populated by people whose ancestors moved. They left situations. But what did they do? They came and they established. They built a trench in that place. So I think the idea that one should be anti-immigration and would kind of belittle people or mock people for immigrating, I reject that. I think that's an unhealthy attitude to have in that sense. But I think what we can have is criticism for people who are immigrating to play this perpetual running game for the easy life. So that's something I would just say about that. Quick point on your great comments there as well is that there's a few ways of thinking about history. And the reality is that all of them are kind of a little bit true to one degree or another. But some people, and it's tended to have been more primitive people, have seen history as a sort of chaotic journey. History kind of happens, it's extremely chaotic. It's kind of random. There's another school of thought that sees history as a sort of progressive long trend. Things always just move in a particular direction. Generally, it's the direction of getting better. Okay, and you see this coming out in the sort of Marxist view of history, but also in modern ideas of history, which is that
in the Great Enlightenment view of history as well. We've reached a certain milestone now; it can only go up from here.
And some people call it the Whig theory of history from the Whig Party in the United Kingdom in the 1800s. So there's this idea of perpetual progress, and then there's this idea of cycles.
Yeah, in almost a Spenglerian way.
Yeah, so there's this kind of cyclical idea. Now, I think all three have elements of truth. I think history has a chaotic element to it. I think it has a progressive element to it. I mean, here we sit. This isn't the Stone Ages anymore, right? So there is that. Okay, and then there's the cyclical element, which is, I suppose, the element that emphasizes the most human nature as an unchanging thing, as a thing, imbued to us by God, and something that we have to grapple with perpetually, right? And
it's human nature that inevitably locks us into these cycles because you can't break it.
Yeah, and that's, by the way, that's not a bad thing. That's how things have been designed. So we're in this kind of cyclical dimension as well. But I think if you emphasize that cyclical component of history, it can help you understand a lot about how things go wrong. But also, I think it can, I would hope that it can eliminate some of the intense nihilism that we feel, because cycles have an up cycle as well. They have the turnaround point. Things don't stay bad forever. There is progress in history, in the good sense. Right?
Yeah, in Afrikaans you say die wiel draai. The wheel turns.
Yeah, and so through this progressive arc of history, which is undoubtedly there, we have these cycles. And so it might be that over the next 100 years from now, things are amazing. We have even more interesting technology. Societies find really cool, interesting ways to organize themselves. Political technology, just all kinds of things. Right? Life could be amazing in 100 years' time. But between now and that point, we can go through cycles, and those cycles, a short cycle in history, a short bad portion of a cycle can be 20 or 30 years. There's loads of examples of history where for 20, 30, 40 years things didn't get better, maybe even got quite substantially worse. I mean, that's half a lifetime. Yeah. It's very little.
And then there are times where there's 30 years of absolute prosperity. Where we maybe saw at the end point of the previous century, where people thought we've reached it now. We've reached the plateau of prosperity in regards that we're never going back to the century that we're leaving behind, or we've solved a lot of the problems that we struggled with now.
So for me, a good bet is in the short term, and by that I mean short term in historical length of time, so 10, 20, 30 years. 30 years is half a generation, short term. The good bet is to bet on the cycle being dominant. And then you've got to try and understand where you are in the cycle. Okay.
This is a very economist way of approaching history.
Sure. In the long term, you'd be quite foolish to bet against the last 5,000 years of human history, right? It's a pretty impressive trend of ongoing improvement. Now, some people might say, "Wow, there were hundreds of years of stagnation in the Middle Ages and all this kind of thing." I mean, I don't think that's I don't think that's necessarily right. But anyway, that's kind of details on the point. I think that so I think it's a good idea to be very optimistic about the very long term. And then it's a good idea to adjust your levels of optimism over the short term, depending on how the situation is unfolding. We could go through another 10, 20 difficult years, globally, domestically, and that could get to a point where things have reordered themselves in a particular way that could usher in a tremendous era of prosperity, of peace, of progress, of all sorts of good things. And one's got to play that as it lies, I guess. But I think understanding these cycles and thinking beyond your life a little bit as well, I think is really important, because I see a lot of nihilism, and particularly around antinatalism. People essentially saying having children is immoral. Basically, it's adding to the population. It's not only cruel to the child because you bring them into a chaotic world, but you're kind of depleting the world's resources and so on. So there's this real antinatalist movement, and of course, people are very bleak at the moment. They think that we're sliding into the most unimaginable tyranny and resource wars and just all kinds of things. Now, that some of that may or may not be true to whatever degree. It's kind of almost beside the point. I think the real issue is, so they're saying, well, therefore we're not going to have children. And I'm saying, well, you lose 100% of the hands you don't play, right? And history, and the future belongs to those who show up. And history is cyclical. This isn't going to be around forever. And in fact, raising children through difficult times actually might be one of the best things you can do for children. It might be
it will amount to a heroic act.
It can amount to a heroic act, and also enable them to grow up with just the right kinds of stresses and strains and kind of difficulties that enable them to have very fulfilling and fulfilled and excellent lives. Now, the counter to that would be, well, if there's total chaos and calamity, then people die, children die en masse. There's been wars where the young children have died. And I think it's at this point in the discussion where you reach an impasse between those who are willing to act not out of pure cognitive kind of rationality per se, or rationalism, let's put it that way, but out of a kind of act of faith, to say that I'm actually going to invest, and then I'm going to dig trenches to make sure that these chaoses and calamities don't befall us. It's taking the opposite view to the fatalism and the inevitabilism of this nihilistic view. Like there's nothing we can do. The Chinese are coming, history's coming, and it's going to smash you over the head. And it's like, no, we actually have agency. We have the ability to take a stand. We have the ability to dig a trench. We have the ability to make plans. And I think a perfect example is a group like AfriForum. It made a plan. It did something. It created an idea and a movement, and it created an organization. And the community that depends on it is better off for it, right? So I think what we've one of the things I'm hitting on here, and I see this a lot in this, particularly in this generation, that's come through many decades of let's say easy life, is the idea that somehow history just happens to you, and things were built in the past, and we don't build anything new now. It's all been done. It's all been built, and
the house has been built. We just live in it now.
We just live in it, and now the arc of history is set, and we're just kind of now there at its mercy. And I mean, the pathological opposite view would be to sort of say that like I'm 100% in control of the destiny of history, and you sort of overinflate your importance. I mean, sure, we're small cogs in a very big wheel here, but if you organize properly, and I think part of this defeatism that I see amongst a lot of nihilistic people comes from the atomization of society. They don't actually believe that they can fight back because they actually are so alone. They're so detached. They're so isolated. And so no wonder they feel helpless. And I think that's precisely why the way out of this, the way out of the nihilism, the way out of the negativity is you have to start creating that team, that tribe, that club. It's one of the things we're talking a lot about at Sakeliga now is, we're building a tribe, we're building a club, and that club lives by a different code. It rejects the alien code that we're forced to live under. It rejects that demoralizing pseudo morality that we're told, that we're gaslighted into thinking is the way to go, right? And it says no, we're gonna bring people together and start creating that new code, and that's precisely, I think, what AfriForum are doing as well.
And I mean, that's what we're seeing through a lot of this historical revisionism that I think has become very popular in our times as well, is that by revising the past to make it resemble the present more, the present values and ideas more, it creates that idea of like history has always been this, you don't live in extraordinary times, you don't live in a time where you can really do anything. Everyone's always just been in this helpless position that you are now.
Such a good observation. Yeah, thinking boys can be girls and girls can be boys has kind of always been normal.
And the thing about what you're seeing, for example, with the modern world and this type of desperation is that people hear conversations like this. They hear people talking about, you should dig a trench. Now, maybe the big question then that sprouts from that is, how do you actually do it? Do you pick up your shovel and start digging a hole in the ground, or what do you actually in practical terms mean? By if someone listens to this and is inspired to that point, they say, well, I'm going to take that mindset. What does it actually entail?
That's a great question, something that I'm grappling with, still working through. The the one thing that's really grabbed me in the last number of years is, we've lived for quite a long time now in such a cyber dominated world, such an online kind of dominated reality, as it were. And I think we've potentially overemphasized the importance of that in relation to the importance of physical space. I've become really aware of the importance of inhabiting a physical domain. Like you might have a bunch of friends on Facebook, but like that's actually loneliness. You actually have to. We got to be thinking really hard about physical places and loving a place, loving a physical place, and physically investing in it. So I think digging a trench in part means, digging physical foundations of a house or a building or a property, owning. We're also a generation, younger generations are that they don't own much. We need to increase ownership, because ownership is responsibility, it's maturity, it's stewardship. So digging a trench means, where is the physical domain that I can actually get my hands dirty, either physically with the soil, or kind of in a metaphorical sense of like, I'm gonna build something here. I'm gonna create something here. I'm gonna create a church. I'm gonna create a community institution. I'm gonna build a business. I'm gonna fix the schools, because the schools in this particular environment are all broken, or there's none. There's no schools. So we're gonna build one. We're gonna found a school. Maybe it's gonna have only 10 kids at the start, but we're gonna build it. A lot of us in South Africa went to schools that were founded in the 1800s or in the early 1900s by people who at the time it would have seemed quite like perhaps even a lost cause. It was this might have been a single little schoolhouse with 20 pupils in it on a patch of dirt. And 100 years later it was this like thriving school that was putting 1,000 boys through it every few years. So I think place is really interesting. We live in a world where people, as I said earlier, where you can live anywhere. So as a result, people forget to live somewhere. To actually pick the place and say, this is somewhere that I can envisage, I can invest, and I can build for generations. And it's kind of it's a cliched line, but planting trees whose shade that you won't sit under. That's an overused line maybe, but because it's true. That kind of investment is powerful, multi-generational investment that creates the towns on the Italian coastline, let's say, that the laptop jockey finds so beautiful when he goes and works there for 6 months a year, because people invested significant amounts there. So place is important. And I think people and place, building a community. Imagine grandchildren growing up in the same place, and there's 3 or 4 generations of families that are there. So the grandchildren are friends. Their parents are friends who grew up together, and their grandparents grew up in the same place. And you have this really rich, deep sort of community life in a place that everyone's investing into. So for me, that might still sound a little bit abstract, and it's not easy to get together in this world of fragmentation. We all live in, we're all scattered. Our families are scattered. We all live apart. So how do we start coordinating with one another, with friends, with community, with your cultural community, to go and inhabit really a physical space or several physical spaces where you can then start to live out real life. Technology doesn't go away. You still have online life. It's still amazing. You can still send your show over right now to people in America, and you've got followers there, and that's great. But if that's your existence, you're going to be lonely, depressed, and that's what we've seen. We've seen young people who live an online life get nihilistic, lonely, depressed, suicidal. This has all come through in the last 10 or 15 years of mass social media. We've got to re-engage, to my mind, the physical realm, physical locations, and kind of do real exploits in those places. Don't just be a renter who lives on his laptop in a place. That's not, you're not really, you're there, you're sort of living there because you physically have to be somewhere, but you're not kind of loving that place and sinking real skin in the game into that place. So I think that's what I mean about digging a trench. And then I suppose the final element of that, people, place, it's got to be secure. You've got to secure it. So digging a trench means actually creating a safe society. And that, yes, that means physical security. It means arm yourself. It means be willing to use lethal force against evil people, against the forces of chaos who would come and seek to destroy you, who would seek to, kill and rape and murder and do all sorts of those things. That's what digging a trench means as well. It means being able to resist the tyranny of large tyrannical states through very clever mechanisms of trade, for example, or of any kind of institutional mechanism that allows you to resist the government. And then, of course, as I say, and there's a physical component to that. So digging a trench is a war metaphor. And at some level, I mean, in modern times, we might not dig physical trenches because that might not work so well with modern technology, warfare technology. But you need, the community that you create has to be able to be safe. We've just lived through one of the most awful episodes in the post-94 South Africa with the KwaZulu-Natal riots and absolute destruction of multiple towns and business districts and so on. And then we witnessed also communities defending themselves. Some of them did it successfully, some of them less so. But the people who were able and willing to defend themselves physically, they're the people who've dug a trench, and they're saying, I'm going to fight for what I've created in this particular place. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about as well. So, I mean, I think that question could be probably a whole 10 podcast episodes of how you establish flourishing societies in beautiful places that are kept safe. But those are the sorts of dimensions that I think people should be thinking of.
And I think that idea of whether to move or whether to dig a trench is perfectly demonstrated by the story of the Boers, the Great Trek from the Cape, where there was not a situation there where they can stay in the Cape. They have to move, or else they would live under the thumb of the British Empire and their children would anglicize. But then when they moved and they settled and the empire followed them, that's when they dug their trenches, and that's when the events of the Anglo-Boer War, the First and Second Anglo-Boer War, ironically the war within which trench warfare was for the first time en masse used.
Yeah.
So
there you go. That's a great point. Great sort of analogy, and I think you see this in many instances of history. There's a time when a people have to run and have to leave. There's such immense hardship and persecution and pain. French Huguenots are a good example of that. The early pilgrims to America might be an example of that. But then a generation decided, that's behind us. We need to dig a trench. What I would say to that is that the trench mindset also doesn't have to now be the forever mindset. So you once moved, now you've dug a trench. A few generations later, there might be a rationale to move again, for whatever reason, because history's complex, life changes, things change. But again, it's what are the reasons you're doing it? Are they the right reasons? And are you going somewhere where you then have the capacity to dig that trench again? And again, to get to the sort of central idea of this talk, this interview, there's so many people whose moving is justified just basically because they're running. They're running to safety. They're running to comfort. Comfort is a addictive drug. It's a very addictive drug, but it's a drug, and drugs don't end well, So it's not that you have to sign up for a life of absolute hardship and toil and all this stuff. But if you're just escaping into the if you're running to escapism or nihilism, those are bad reasons to be moving, and that stuff's going to catch up with you. Make no mistake, that's going to catch up with you. You're at best, you're buying yourself some time to be able to live in this particular way, but you're not really getting to the heart of the issue, and you're not establishing a situation where you yourself are figuring out how you're going to root yourself somewhere and defend it. And therefore, what you're doing, if you have children, is you're passing that problem on. It's an inevitable choice, but you're passing it on to your children and your grandchildren. And you might be okay with that, but I don't want to do that. I want to make that choice now as best as I can. I'm trying to figure all this out myself. I'm a child of modern liberalism. So we're all kind of recovering, in a sense, from this past that we've come through. And we're now trying to figure out, in this slightly chaotic world, and maybe even very chaotic world, how do we start creating order again? And how do we consolidate and bring this back to a place that's actually where we can start creating and cultivating truth, goodness, beauty, these classical virtues. That's the journey that I think, I'm on. I'm trying to figure that out as I go. And I know you're on a similar journey, and I think that's where we want to be sort of heading to. So the more we can kind of share ideas on this stuff, whether it's philosophical, whether it's very practical, at a very practical local level, but then also the broader ideas of what we're trying to do, and inspire a tribe of people who care about the same sort of values, that we can get alongside us and actually go and build these things that we're talking about. That for me is a very exciting project, and I feel like right now in South Africa, it's one of the best places in the world to be trying to do this kind of project. So for me, right now, never say never on any opportunities or possibilities in the future, but I think it's worth a punt. It's worth a bet.
Russell, I think that's the perfect place to end this conversation on more of a personal note on why both you and I are on that trench digging mindset, but right here in South Africa on this dark continent. Thank you very much for joining me today. It was a absolutely great conversation. I mean, I don't even know how long it took, but the time flew by.
Just under an hour.
All right, but Russell, have a nice rest of your day. I'm definitely going to have you back for another chat in the future. And also to anyone listening, if you enjoy this type of conversation, you can subscribe. You can also leave a like. You can leave a comment below with your thoughts. I read all of them. I respond to as many as I can. And then also you can find Russell. Always links to where he puts his stuff and all his writing are in the description. You can go check it out. And then also in the future, if you want to keep updated on what's happening on this channel, you can also join my Telegram channel. There's also a link to that in the description to keep up to date on what's going on. So cheers, guys. Have a good one, and God bless.
And a lot of people fighting back against this nonsense. Conscious Caracal, whoever he or she is one of them.